It's an exciting topic. That's why they put it in this slot. As you will learn as I go through my presentation, you will see that the procurement law has changed a little bit over the last few years. And the way I was able to do that was whenever I wanted to make a change, I would draft a bill. And then when I would testify in a room just like this, if I saw a member of the legislature getting interested in what I was talking about, I would just kind of talk in a monotone and say the word procurement. That induces drowsiness every time. And then I wouldn't have to worry about, difficult questions. I could just get my bill passed. But we will try to have a little bit more exciting time than that. I'm not trying to induce drowsiness. Wow. The sources of Nevada procurement law, the big one for us is Chapter 333 of NRS. That is the State Purchasing Act, which was enacted in 1951, and which originally, the way purchasing operated was every year the administrator would try to decide how many desks and manual typewriters and slide rules the state needed, and would go make one purchase to last the year, put that in, all that stuff in a warehouse, and would hand it out as needed. Things have changed over the last 75 years. We are now a service-based economy. We have much more complicated needs than just manual typewriters and slide rules. State purchasing handles things like $14 billion Medicaid contracts. But state purchasing does still buy desks and does things like buying hay for the prison ranch. So it's a wide range of things. Basically anything that is not a building, that's Public Works 338, or a road, that's NDOT 408, falls within state purchasing's responsibilities. 332 is different. That's what local governments procure under. That's not us. They have it a little easier than we do. Their law provides a whole lot of exemptions, like for IT stuff. Which would make our life a whole lot easier, but we don't have that exemption in our law. 277 is interlocal agreements. Those are agreements between governmental entities, and we'll just touch on those later. NAC is important because NAC 333 is where we have all the requirements about who can serve on the evaluation committees for an RFP. So we need to be familiar with those or be able to look those up. And SAM is really important because a lot of our 75-year-old law is kind of bare bones. SAM expands upon that a great deal. Chapter 100 of SAM will give you the requirements of the Board of Examiners regarding what they want submitted and how they do contract approvals. SAM 300 has all the purchasing stuff. So who does this apply to? You. The definition of using agencies is very broad, and as you can see, it applies to officers, departments, institutions, boards, commissions, and other agencies in the executive department. So I may use the term agency when talking about boards and commissions, because for purposes of 333, you are a using agency as a term of art in 333. It applies no matter where the money's coming from. If you're hiring a contractor, a vendor to do something, if the money comes from the state, obviously you're complying with 333. What if it comes from the feds? It just seems like free money, right? No, you still have to comply with 333. And for two reasons. One, our law says it doesn't matter what the source of the funds are, you have to comply with 333. Also, the feds say that. And that's that CFR citation I had there, 2 CFR 200.317, which basically says, in Fed speak, if you're going to spend federal money, you need to comply with your own state's procurement rules. And you may not like complying with our procurement rules, but the alternative would be the federal government coming up with its own set of procurement rules for us. And we don't want that. So we should be grateful that we just have to comply with 333. And when I say it doesn't matter where the money comes from, even if it's like private donor money, if you have a wealthy benefactor who wants to give money for some reason, first of all, that should raise red flags regarding ethics. What do they want for that money? That's kind of a Ross question. But even if it's just private donor money, if it gets spent, has to be spent in compliance with 333, unless you're the Department of Wildlife. They have a specific statute that lets them accept money from wealthy hunters and spend it however they want. But the rest of you don't have a statutorily authorized slush fund, so you have to comply with 333. There are exceptions, INSHE, local governments, because they comply with their own thing. And the housing division of the Department of Business and Industry has their own carve-out because of some of the way they do their housing projects. But it is a complete exemption from 333. Why is all this stuff we're going to talk about today important? State policy is to secure best value. Best value is the guiding principle of our purchasing. And it kind of means what you think it means. It means, getting good value for the taxpayer dollars. It doesn't always mean lowest price. When we go out and look for services, we don't have, as I'll talk later, we don't even have to score cost at all, but we can make cost as big or as little as we want when we're going out in an RFP to get a services contract. So we can adjust how big of a role that plays. So knowing how this works will make things go more quickly, keep you in compliance with the law, because here's where I scare you. There is personal responsibility. If you commit to a contract that does not comply with Chapter 333, that contract is void. Now, the lawyers are probably thinking, don't I remember something from contract law? There's a difference between void contracts and voidable contracts. And there is. A voidable contract is like a minor enters into a contract, and then someone acting on behalf of that minor can still enforce that contract, or it can be voided at the option of the minor or the party acting on behalf of the minor. Our contracts are void ab initio. And yes, I did just work some Latin into my presentation. So if you're doing presentation bingo, you can mark off the Latin box, which means they don't ever exist. They had no legal existence. So now you're going to ask, Kev, if it had no legal existence, how can I be liable for it? Well, there are legal theories where if the vendor relied upon what you said and expended money as part of the contract, they can come back and try to get that money from us. And that is where an individual or a head of a using agency can technically be held liable for that money. Additionally, it is illegal to bind the state beyond the amount approved by law. This is malfeasance in office. That's a Ross thing. And possibly even a misdemeanor, which would be a criminal law thing. I've never seen either of these put into place in the time that I've worked, both at the Attorney General's office and the time I served as administrator for state purchasing. But they are there, and it's a good reason to take all of this seriously. Even if it doesn't rise to the level of you being held personally financially responsible or a misdemeanor, you don't want to be a headline. You don't want the Las Vegas Review-Journal or one of the investigative reporters from the TV stations doing a story about how you gave a contract to your brother-in-law instead of going through the appropriate processes that 333 require. And one of the biggest pitfalls in this area is when you go into a procurement with the idea that you've already decided who your vendor should be. You shouldn't lock in on a vendor before you go through the process, because if you have to do a competitive solicitation, you have to treat all vendors fairly. And not only does this get into the stuff Ross said this morning about potential corruption, remember the stuff Leslie said about the Public Records Act. If you've got an email that says, oh, we already know what vendor we want to use, but purchasing's making us do an RFP, You're not going to want to have to explain that email once it sees the light of day through a public records request, right? That's going to be very embarrassing. It's going to make it look like you were corrupt, even if you did then follow through on the complying with the law. So think in terms of compliance. Think in terms of doing the right thing from the beginning. And from the beginning brings me to maybe the two most important things I will talk about, which is giving yourself time in the procurement process. The biggest mistakes we see in purchasing world is when an agency puts things off to the last minute. Say the legislature gave you an appropriation to buy something, and you've let almost 2 years go by, and now you're like, we need to spend this. That's when you try to cut corners and potentially make mistakes and fail to comply with our law. You need to start the process early and reach out to state purchasing early, because they're there to help you through this process. I have seen agencies think that, well, if we don't tell purchasing what we're doing, then we don't have to comply with their law. No, the law applies to you whether purchasing knows about it or not. It's just that purchasing can help make sure that you comply with the law so that you don't get in trouble with, like auditors later down the road. So goods or services. This is a big distinction in our law. Services we typically contract for using a request for proposals. We'll talk more about that later. It results in a contract for services of independent contractor, which we will also talk more about later. And this requires DAG review as to form, the thing that DAGs get asked to review and sign routinely. These contracts go to BOE for approval. This brings up the issue of allowing yourself time for the process to work out, because going to BOE and getting on the BOE agenda, if you have to get full board approval, is something that can take, up to 7 weeks after you submit it to GFO. So it can really add to your timeline. Goods, on the other hand, are much simpler. We do an invitation to bid, and the bid contract is something that the terms the vendor has agreed to that gets attached to a standard form from purchasing, which is basically just the terms from the Uniform Commercial Code. Those types of warranties and things are all included in that. No BOE approval is required for goods, except for one type of good, which we will talk about later. SAM 305 has all these lovely numbers telling you when purchasing has to do the procurement, when you can do it yourself. If it's a contract for services greater than equal or greater to $100,000, purchasing has to do it unless purchasing grants you approval to do it. Purchasing does have that flexibility. If it's services greater than 25 or less than 100, the agency does a formal RFP. But if you're not comfortable doing the formal RFP, purchasing can do it for you. Purchasing also has a lot of great forms on their toolbox. If you go to purchasing's website, there's a box that says toolbox, and it has all the forms you would need to do an RFP. It has these contracts that we're going to talk about. If it's a services contract for less than $25,000, the agency does an informal solicitation, and informal solicitations are described at SAM 313. Basically, it's getting 3 quotes. And this idea of getting 3 quotes before you hire someone, I recommend doing it in your private life as well. A couple of years ago, I had a giant pine tree blow down at my house, and I had to pay someone to come cut it up and take it away. And I got 3 quotes. And the third quote was about $1,000 cheaper than the first quote. So it gets best value for the state to get 3 quotes, and it can be quite useful, in your private life to get 3 quotes whenever you need to hire someone. Goods, if it's greater than $50,000, purchasing does the bid, sealed bids, which they do through their Nevada ePro system. If it's greater than 5,000 or up to 50,000, the agency does it, but purchasing will review before it's finalized to make sure that it was done correctly. And less than 5, it's an agency informal. That's another, 3-quote situation. Special approvals. I just decided to throw this in here. IT components and phone systems, the Governor's Technology Office will look at those to make sure they're compatible with what we already have. Software is also another big one. There are types of software that we cannot use at the state. I'm not going to ask if any of you use Grammarly. I know you don't, because the Governor's Technology Office has said we can't. Because one of Grammarly's terms and conditions is that when you run information through their software, they own it. Not the kind of thing you would know unless you read the fine print. So there are certain software things we cannot use. And speaking of software, we talked about the difference between goods and services. Is software a good or a service? If you don't really know, that's fine. The courts have been wrestling with it for about 40 years and still don't have a clear idea. The software companies themselves really want it to be a service. That's why you hear about software as a service, and they're trying to set it up so that it's a service. And the reason they do that is so the protections in the Uniform Commercial Code that attach to the sale of goods don't apply. They don't have those to deal with those warranties and those kinds of things. So they desperately want it to be a service. For our purposes, there is a provision in SAM that says software. And how we treat it for procurement purposes is if it's commercial off-the-shelf software like Adobe Acrobat licenses, for example. We just treat those as goods. If it's something that is going to have to be customized for us, we treat that as a service, because that's when we're going to need to make sure that we have the protections in our full contract in there, things that say like we maintain ownership and control of the data. Another aspect of that is we always have to make sure our state data stays within the United States. You will see proposals from vendors saying that they can do a great job working for us because they use a follow the sun model. Follow the sun model means that your data is going to India. It's the idea is they can work on it round the clock. Yeah, maybe 8 hours in the United States and then 16 hours in India. So it is kind of following the sun, but can't do that. The Governor's Technology Office has decreed that we cannot allow our data to leave the United States. And there are various reasons for that, to protect our data and always be able to control what's done with it. I mentioned earlier that there are goods that BOE approves. Yeah, vehicle purchases. Those go to the Board of Examiners, new and used vehicles. And I can tell you that one of the things purchasing has bought in the past was a helicopter for wildlife. Turns out when you buy a helicopter, you got to get an upgraded engine because Nevada's at altitude. You have to get a stronger engine so that the rotor spins faster so that you get lift in our thin atmosphere. That helicopter didn't get approved by BOE. NDOT's airplanes didn't get approved by BOE. And when you buy an airplane, by the way, you need to make sure you get the navigation software included. NDOT bought an airplane a few years ago, sent their pilots to Texas to pick it up, and I get a panicky phone call because they didn't go through purchasing to buy the airplane like they should have. It's only when they went to pick up the plane they realized that the plane did not come with navigation software. So they asked me for emergency approval back when I was administrator of state purchasing to buy navigation software. And I didn't ponder this very long. I thought it was probably a good idea that the brand new Nevada plane that was being flown from Texas to Nevada didn't accidentally crash in Guatemala. So I said yes to the navigation software. But we buy helicopters, we buy planes, we buy huge pieces of equipment. Don't go to BOE for approval. But a used car does. Yeah, it's because this requirement was put in the law in 1933. Back when the purchase of a car was a pretty big deal for the state. And it has stayed there. And if this sounds, like a pain, you should know that for decades there was actually a dollar limit on how much you could spend on cars. And after the inflation of the 70s, the 1981 legislature finally gave up on those dollar limits. And at that time, you could spend up to $6,000 for a car, or up to $8,000 for a cruiser for highway patrol, or up to $10,000 for one vehicle for the governor. Maybe with what we're paying for vehicles now, maybe it makes sense that BOE is approving them because they're definitely more expensive than $6,000. Having told you that there are all these rules that could throw you in jail and make you financially liable, I should say there are no shortcuts. Here are the shortcuts. These are legal shortcuts. These aren't just ignore the law, don't comply with the law. These are the shortcuts that are part of our law. And the number one shortcut is that purchasing division has statewide agreements in place. And it's an easy button to hit. You don't have to go do your own solicitation. The contracts I've been signing recently for state purchasing, translation and interpretation contracts. So if you have a board or commission, you're prosecuting a case against a licensee and that English is not that licensee's first language. Who knows what kind of interpreter you may need, but state purchasing has those contracts. And if you go to purchasing's website, you can find the translation and interpretation contracts listed under the statewide contracts. You will see the purchasing officer is Miriam Garcia. If you contact Miriam, she's very nice and very helpful, and she will help you find what you need. The statewide contracts also include lots of common items like furniture for an office. You can buy boxes of pens through the Staples punch-out. You can access things through Amazon because state purchasing has an Amazon account. And it's a great way to you can do different comparison pricing that way too. I know that traditionally, copy paper has been cheaper at Staples than it is anywhere through Amazon. None of the suppliers on Amazon can give it to us at the price that Staples does. Don't know why that is. It just usually works out that way. But you have options because these contracts are there and you can use them as needed. There are also contracts for more esoteric things. One of the first RFPs I approved as administrator was for bat gates. It's not a cool Batman thing. Abandoned mines. We have abandoned mines in Nevada, and we also have stupid people. And when those two things come together, people die. So bat gates are gates that close off the abandoned mine, but allow the bats to fly in and out. We have 8 vendors currently under contract who can install bat gates. We have software of different types under these contracts. We have people who can implement the software. We have temporary employment services, like the manpower agreements. That's a statewide contract. If you just need temp help, you can contact Annette at Purchasing, Annette Morphin. She will help you with that. And it's a great, easy button. Shortcut number 2, the Preferred Purchase Program. This is my favorite thing the state does. This is Opportunity Village and other organizations that help the differently abled. If you have a building that you need janitorial work done, You can do an RFP and try to find a company that will come in and do the janitorial work. Or you can call Opportunity Village. They can come out, look at the space, give you a quote, and you can just contract with them. And they do other things like document destruction, document collation, and some other things. And they do very good work. And it's a nice expenditure of state funds when we're getting value for what we're taxpayer dollars while also helping Opportunity Village and other organizations like that. Shortcut number 3. Yes, we have desks on contract, but what if you're strapped for cash? We have a state surplus property program where there are things that agencies no longer need that get turned over to state purchasing. There are desks, there are chairs, there are a lot of different things like that. It's also how our vehicles get done, sometimes between different agencies. You can contact Judy Gates at Purchasing. It's on the website and see what they have. And you can get stuff for free. There's also a federal surplus property program that works a little more difficultly. You kind of have to let the people at State Purchasing know what you're in the market for, and they will pay attention to what shows up on the federal website. And if you get something from the feds will technically own it for the first 2 years after you've put it in use. But after you've had it in use for 2 years, you have full ownership of it. The exception being weapons. The Fed never lets you own the weapon for good. You have to give that back once you're done with it. Because yes, you can get weapons. And yes, State Purchasing has had weapons on contract for many years. I signed a contract for grenade launchers because for riot control purposes, corrections and highway patrol may need to launch smoke or tear gas grenades. So if you need a grenade launcher, don't contact Purchasing, talk to your DAG, because something's gone horribly wrong if you think you need a grenade launcher. Shortcut number 4, speaking of the feds, it could be the vendor you want to do business with has a contract with the General Services Administration. If so, if that vendor's willing to offer us the same prices, we have a specific statute that lets us just use it. Shortcut number 5. What about another state or jurisdiction did a solicitation and awarded to a vendor? And we kind of like that contract. This gets called joinder, but we don't actually join the contract. We don't join it and create three-way privity in the contract. What we do is we use this other jurisdiction's solicitation, if it was done kind of the same way we do ours, and we use it to enter our own contract with that vendor as long as it's similar pricing. And there are certain requirements that are part of this. Most of those have come through Governor's Finance Office, there's forms that have to be filled out to get this approved. Another shortcut while we're talking about other state solicitations, many of those statewide contracts I talked about are procured through NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officials. And all 50 states are a member. A lead state will go out and procure a contract that then every state can join on to. That is how we get our cell services. That's actually NASPO's biggest contract. All 50 states sign on to that contract. And so if you need a cell phone and you want to go to the wireless devices contract on our statewide contracts list at Purchasing, you can see Verizon and AT&T, and you can see there are certain discounts they've agreed to through that NASPO contract that Nevada has agreed to. And a lot of the other statewide contracts are that way too, that give us access to software companies. And by joining together with NASPO, it allows us to negotiate a better deal than we could get on our own. There's a lot more spend at stake. It's also true that if you just like a solicitation done by another state, you can really copy a lot of it when you have to do your own RFP. Shameless copying is perfectly okay in procurement world. There are exemptions. There aren't, well, maybe you can think of them as shortcuts. There are things that are not suitable for competitive solicitation. Sole source, as approved by the administrator. There are times when there are legitimate sole source instances. If we have a piece of equipment and we need something that fits into that piece of equipment, and it has to be like John Deere compatible, it has to fit, then that's a legitimate sole source. Another way this comes up is sometimes the state purchasing will approve agencies to continue using a vendor they've been using for years. BOE generally requires contracts to be resolicited every 4 years. But if you've invested millions of dollars in a big IT system and software system, 4 years come along, you don't really want to go out and recompete that. You've got a lot of sunken costs there. So at that time, we'll talk later about contract extensions. Purchasing can agree that, you don't have to go resolicit that. You can continue using the vendor you have. Emergencies, these are, there's flooding and we need barriers put up, that kind of thing. I was administrator of state purchasing during the COVID pandemic. I may have set a record for the most emergency contracts ever approved by an administrator of state purchasing. At the time, I was criticized for not approving enough emergency contracts. Once the pandemic was over, I was criticized for approving too many. So I must have been somewhere in the ballpark of about right. Professional services exemptions. There are certain contracts that by reg we just don't compete. Expert witness. You can't really do an RFP for an expert witness. You kind of have to disclose your case and the details about your case. Same thing with an attorney. With an accountant, oftentimes there may be financial details that would be important to whether an accountant wants to do the work, and you don't want to disclose those publicly. On the accountant one, just because you're doing an audit doesn't mean, and you want to hire an accountant, doesn't mean that the exemption automatically applies. You need an audit for which a CPA is required. There needs to be a professional license required. Some audits don't require a CPA. Engineers and architects. There are statutes that prohibit us from going with an engineer and architect based on just low cost. Reason for that is you don't want a cut-rate architect making a bad building that collapses. Engineer could do a bad dam that bursts, that kind of thing. I had someone come to me, an agency come to me, I will not name them, claiming that, well, we can hire a landscape architect without having to go through the process. I said, okay, they're not a registered architect, not dissing what landscape architects do, but the grass and trees in front of your building, not the same thing as the building itself that could collapse and kill someone. So, no. But the administrator of purchasing does have discretion to decide when the services of another professional are not adapted to competitive solicitation. When we look for services, we look for the best interest of the state as determined by the scores in the proposals submitted in response to a request for proposals. The criteria are disclosed in the RFP, and the criteria can be almost anything you want. Up until 2019, there were 4 criteria in statute, one of which was cost. I thought that was stupid, so I got rid of it. And now you can use anything you want, and you don't always have to score on cost. There are times when you wouldn't want to score on cost. Because if you get like a grant of money from the feds, you want to spend that entire amount. You don't want to award it to someone who's not going to use that whole amount. Because if you don't use all the money that comes in from the feds and you have to give it back to them, the feds make note of that, and it's harder to get money from them in the future. Maybe that's how a country ends up $40 trillion in debt. I don't know, but that's how the process works. With goods, it's a much simpler process. We put our specs out there. Here's what we need. Anyone who meets those specs, we go with the low cost. This comes up far more often than it should. Do you have the money to pay for this? before you engage in the whole RFP process, and there are more things to talk about there, make sure you have the money for it. We have put RFPs out on the street after a lot of effort, and the vendors submit their proposals, and then the agency decides, oh no, we can't afford this. Let's cancel the RFP. You can do that, but you leave some ticked off vendors because it costs a lot of money to put together a proposal in response to an RFP. And you've wasted a lot of state time too. Do you need a tie? Obviously, you shouldn't take fashion advice from me. This is a technology investment evaluation. This is what the Governor's Technology Office has to approve if you are spending $50,000 or more on technology. This replaces what were known as TINs and SINs, technology investment notifications, cloud investment notifications. They used to be known as TIRES at one point. Why EATS, formerly OCIO, formerly GTO was OCIO, was EATS, was DoIT, and now the forms they use keep changing too. Just to keep you on your toes. They're my client too, so I can say that. It can take up to 6 weeks to get a tie completion memo from GTO. So once again, time is important in this whole process. RFPs. If you can't use a shortcut and you do have to do an RFP, put thought into exactly what services you need. Your RFP can be as prescriptive as you like. If you know exactly what you need, say so. If you have a problem that needs to be solved by a vendor, you can kind of leave that a little more open, if you like, and see what kind of proposals you get, what kind of solutions you get to your problem. Insurance requirements get put into the RFP. Risk has a book, has something online. I'll talk about that later, where you get that from. Deliverable-based contract. This is important. You don't want to do a contract where you hire a vendor and then just hand them a bunch of money and hope they do what you want them to do, right? But if you tell the vendor, I'm not going to pay you until you're completely done on like a big IT project, the vendor's going to go, I'm not going to do that. So in your RFP, which you're already starting to put together the basis of what should be a good contract because the RFP gets attached to the contract, set out the deliverables and a pay schedule. You don't know how much money necessarily will be spent at this point, but you can say 10% for completing this and 10% for completing that and so forth. It's much preferable to liquidated damages provisions. I have seen agencies say, well, in order to make sure that they're on time getting this done, let's put penalties in the contract. You can't put penalties in the contract. The Nevada Supreme Court has said penalties are not enforceable. So you have to call them liquidated damages. And the liquidated damages have to be a good faith estimate of the actual damages the state would sustain from things not being done on time. The whole idea behind that is that in contracts you get your expectation damages, you get the value of your contract as damages. If penalties were allowed, it would be possible to make more off of a contract than what you had originally planned on. There are jurisdictions that allow penalties. There's kind of a trend in that direction, but it hasn't come to Nevada yet. You've got your good RFP out there. The proposals come in. It's time for your evaluation panel, which must comply with the requirements in NAC. It can't all be from one agency. Each division of an agency counts as a using agency, so that makes it a little easier to come up with some diversity on your panel. You can't have a majority of the evaluators report to an evaluator because that person would have too much sway. Once they score the proposals on the criteria you came up with, we reach the notice of intent to award, which goes out to a vendor saying, we're going to try to negotiate a contract with this person. And once we have negotiated a contract, that's when the notice of award gets issued. And that is what the losing vendors can challenge. They have 11 days to post a bond and challenge that. So this is the contract we reach with that vendor. It has to be in writing, it has to be signed, the insurance has to come from risk, and it has to be approved by DAG. Your DAG has to sign off on this. And state contract forms can be found at the purchasing website. Why are our standard contracts important? There are people who will tell you that the three most beautiful words in the English language are, I love you. Those people are wrong. The three most beautiful words in the English language are termination without cause. This is the easy button to get you out of a bad contract. It allows us to term a contract for no reason. We don't have to make a showing that there was a breach. We tell the contract, you've got 30 days to wrap things up, contract's done. This also gives us a lot of leverage in dealing with the vendor, the fact that we have the ability to terminate without cause. The non-appropriation clause is there because we in the executive branch can't promise that the legislature is going to fund anything beyond the next biennium. Our contracts are typically for 4 years. Funding from the legislature comes every 2. I've had vendors say, well, can you promise that, this request for funds won't be unreasonably denied? Like, no. Legislature can be as unreasonable as they want. They're the legislature. Limitations on the state's liability, like Chapter 41, limiting our tort liability, those get set forth in the contract. Those apply by statute anyway. LOL isn't fun. It's just how we call limitation on liability clauses. Vendors will always want to try to limit their liability as much as possible. Sometimes they will try to say things like, well, we're only liable to the extent you've paid us so far. Well, early in a contract, you've paid them almost nothing. They have no liability. Indemnification from the contractor means we're looking for the contractor to make us whole for losses that can occur. This often comes up in a tort context. I'll talk more about that later. Insurance is there for same reason. Assignment is one that can be difficult to negotiate because SAM makes us get the Board of Examiners approval to approve assignment of a contract that they've approved. Vendors don't like that because if they're going to sell their company, they want to be able to sell a portfolio of contracts that are guaranteed in place. That's their revenue stream. So they want to have a provision that says that the assignment is automatic. It can be difficult to explain that to vendors, but ones that deal with the government often tend to know. Warranties, this means that what they're doing will meet basic standards. This is how we say, yeah, your work sucked. You violated the warranty. And the choice of Nevada law and jurisdiction is huge. If we have to get involved in litigation, we don't want that litigation to be taking place in North Dakota. We want it to be taking place right here in our courthouse, Carson City. It reduces our expenses greatly. And in fact, this got added to the law in 2021. I heard that the state of Colorado had done this. And so I talked to a procurement attorney from Colorado and asked if this was if legally saying the state cannot indemnify another party, does that stop vendors from doing business with you? He said, no. They always just agree to it once they see it in statute. So I thought, we should do that. And so that's how this came to be. We no longer have to argue about whether we have to indemnify vendors. That was an argument that went on for years in these contracts. Now we just say, can't do it. And the vendors go, guess you can't do it. Because they don't want to have to make us whole. That's money out of their pocket. And we cannot legally agree to arbitration or litigation in another jurisdiction. So we don't have to argue over that anymore either. It just speeds things up. Beware of contract reforms. I will try not to rant too much on this. I hate when the contractors try to use their own forms and get things like auto renewal. Can't do that. Got to get BOE approval. They want to keep things confidential, a bunch of things confidential. We have public records requirements. Hyperlinks. I hate hyperlinks. They will say, all our terms are here on this hyperlink. Yeah, they can change that. So we want the terms to be printed out in a part of our contract. Obviously, we can't indemnify them or agree to foreign jurisdiction. Hopefully the vendor agreed to our standard terms as part of the RFP process. There are certain things that come up. We put in attachment AA, negotiated items. Don't negotiate against yourself if you end up negotiating with a vendor over something. You love my tie. You want my tie. You say, Kev, I'll give you $50 for the tie. I say, no. You really love my tie. You're willing to spend $100 for this tie. Do you say, will you take 100? No, don't do that. Ask me how much I want for the tie. Maybe I'm willing to part with it for 60. You just saved yourself $40 and got a lovely tie. Same thing happens in negotiating with vendors. If you've got a big IT project and you want them to have, say, 5 people on site, and you didn't put that in your RFP, that would have been the better way to do it. They would have agreed to it up front. But now you're negotiating that. Say you want the 5 people. And if they say no, don't come back and say, oh, well, can we at least have 1? No, get them to counteroffer. And the best time to do that is before we have signed the contract. That's when we have the most leverage. And of course, put everything that they agree to in writing in those negotiated points. Parole evidence basically means, yeah, they said it, but we can't hold them to it because it's not in writing. Insurance provisions. These are in all our contracts, mandated by risk management. We have an insurance schedule. It contains several different types of insurance. And obviously, the cyber insurance is one that probably grabs our attention now more than, say, last summer. We now know how important cyber insurance can be. Why insurance? Well, we have protection under NRS 41 that limits our tort liability. And we have a vendor that says they're going to indemnify us, make us whole in case of a tort claim. But let's say that we hire a vendor to trim the trees here on the lovely Capitol grounds in Carson City. And while trimming a small branch, a big branch they didn't know was rotten inside, falls where they didn't think it was going to fall, and horribly maims a tourist visiting from California. That's my let's maim a Californian. So you might think, well, we have indemnification. The vendor can make us whole for any tort claims against us. What's that vendor likely to do if they're not a very big company and they're facing a multi-million-dollar tort judgment? Because we didn't kill this guy. Personal injury attorneys will tell you that wrongful death claims pay the bills, but horribly injured people are where you make the real money. Because they have ongoing medical bills, ongoing pain and suffering. And this guy's going back to California where healthcare isn't cheap. So what saves us in this instance? If that vendor facing the multi-million-dollar claim files bankruptcy, we have a promise from them to make us whole, but they don't have any money. They may not legally exist in the near future. Insurance is still there. That's why we have insurance in every country, because the insurance companies aren't going bankrupt. We require insurance certificates from companies that are AAA rated. Ultimately, your contract gets approved by the Board of Examiners. Under 2,000, it's just agency approval. Between 2 and 100, that's a significant increase over the last years. It's clerk of the board. That speeds things up quickly. 100 or greater, it goes to the full BOE for approval. State purchasing leases equipment and can approve your leases. Most commonly, you'll see copier leases. Those are statewide contracts. It's pretty simple. Interlocal contracts, these are between government agencies, but they actually require BOE approval. Lease of office space, just throwing it in here. Some boards are exempt from having to go through leasing services. Others aren't. It depends on if you're exempt under 353.005. But you can always ask. Potential problems. Grants. You may think that if you get money from a grant, that you don't have to comply with 333, but remember, it applies no matter what the source. So let's say the Department of Education gets a $1 million grant from the federal government to promote kids staying in school, graduating high school. They decide to spend $500,000 on that with subgrants to school districts, nonprofits that will help kids stay in school. Those are subgrants. That's not handled by 333. The other $500,000 they decide to spend on an advertising campaign to encourage kids to stay in school. That is covered by 333, and that has to be spent in accordance with 333. MOUs, Memorandum of Understanding. Gosh, when I started at the state 9 years ago, there were so many of these running around that were just contracts by another name. They really shouldn't be out there. They're just dangerous. The only time you should really use a Memorandum of Understanding is if you have like multiple agencies working on a big project. Like there was a big fiber cable installation statewide that the Governor's Technology Office was involved in, that NDOT was involved in, that Public Works was involved in. If you want a Memorandum of Understanding so that those agencies know what their different responsibilities are, it's just an agreement amongst the agencies, that's fine. But it's not something to sign with a vendor. Contract amendments, there was a form for doing this at state purchasing. The most simple one is you just substitute language in for the language in the old contract. Extending term, if you're not getting new money, usually this is pretty easy. GFO will agree to this. It's just clerk of the board approval. Can you amend a contract that has expired? No. The contract is not pining for the fjords. It is bereft of life. It is no more. It is an X contract. It cannot be extended. Increasing the not to exceed amount. That's another change. The assignment, whenever you have the change of organization, assignment to a different company, that gets done. New or different service. That's not what we use amendments for. We can't expand the scope. You need to stay within the scope of the initial solicitation and the initial contract. State purchasing offers training. Certified contract manager. Every agency, every board, every commission should have someone who's gone through this training and has access to sets. And my last slide is probably the most important one. People have an idea that once they get Board of Examiner approval, the process has come to an end. I now pronounce you state and vendor. But just like with a marriage, that's not when the process ends. That's when the hard work begins. And you need to keep tabs on the vendor and what they're doing. This is how the state has had big contract failures in the past. Like the Smart 21 project, if that rings a bell for anyone. The state spent tens of millions of dollars and ended up getting nothing from it. We had great contracts in place. Okay, I wrote them, but I wrote 170 pages worth of contracts. They were not the form contracts. They were really detailed contracts that could be used to hold the vendor accountable. But we didn't hold the vendor accountable because we didn't do a good job of contract management. Friendly but not friends. It's okay to have a good working relationship with a vendor. Don't be going out to the bars with them, like with Smart 21. It's not good contract management. Document things as part of your relationship with the vendor. If you have problems, it's okay to call them up the first time and say, hey, there's something you need to work on. The next time, it should be an email and it should specify, here's the provision, here's the contract we're talking about, here's how you're failing. Because that's what your attorney is going to want to see. Written evidence. Get your lawyer involved. Sometimes things can be resolved by a breach letter, where you threaten the vendor saying you're in breach of the contract. This has to comply, like all of these notifications, terminations, or breach, with the notice requirements in Section 4 of the contract, which usually requires certified mail. And if you just reach a point where, you can't get them to perform and you have to get rid of the contract, Final quiz, what are the three most beautiful words in the English language? Termination without cause. Very good, you all pass. So with that, if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them, or at least attempt to. And here's the QR code. No questions? Okay. Oh.
Clarification. So I sit on the Landscape Architects Board.
Oh, sorry about that.
We are a licensed profession, state and vetted, but if you have a contract that goes for more than 4 years, you'll be a team with the architect and the engineer as well. So it's a continuation of the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
No offense taken.
Oh, thank you. Okay. And with that, I think we can send it back down to Las Vegas for the next presentation.